Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming and welcome to the Architectural Association. I realise there are a lot of events on this evening vying for people's attention, so it's really appreciated that you've made it here. My name is Wayne Daly. I'm the graphic designer at the AA. Along with Zach Keyes, I co-direct Bedford Press, which is a private press based here in Bedford Square. Bedford Press was initiated by the AA in 2008 as a publishing imprint that seeks to develop contemporary models of publication practice, and in doing so establishing a more responsive model of small-scale publishing. This is the second in a series of talks where we've invited practitioners and individuals who work with publications as a key part of their practice to discuss their particular interests and interactions with books and other various forms of publishing. Before we begin, could I just remind you all to please turn off your mobile phones or any other devices that might interrupt things. So I'm very pleased to welcome our guest tonight, Alexis Zavialoff. Alexis is a photographer and filmmaker. I think you still are a photographer and filmmaker, is that right? Mm-hmm. But perhaps more importantly for tonight is the proprietor of Motto Distribution, which since its inception in 2007 has rapidly grown to encompass a small chain of 4 bookshops alongside a distribution service for books, magazines, zines, and other various independent printed matter. Motto has also in the last couple of years organised the Unter Dem Motto publishing fair in Berlin in collaboration with Chert Gallery, and continues to co-organise and perhaps colonise many other art book fairs around the globe. Alexis and I will discuss these activities in a bit more detail later on, but I think Alexis is going to begin with a short history of his trajectory, I guess, of how he came to be involved in distribution. I think we'd like to keep it as informal and inclusive as possible, actually. So if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt, and we'll also certainly invite questions at the end. And just lastly, I would like to thank a few people for helping with organising tonight's talk. Zach Keyes, Claire McManus, Phil Clatworthy, Belinda O'Flaherty, Philip Hartstein, Nick Wayne, and Scrat Marshall, who have all helped in organising, promoting, and documenting the talk tonight. So, Alexis, if you could perhaps just begin with a brief potted history.
Hello, and thank you for the invite, Wayne. I'll just take some time to introduce a bit my background so you could understand why I end up in this position now. I'm a self-taught photographer. I started in 93, 94. I'm French with a Russian grandfather, which explains the name. And I usually was based in Switzerland. Now I'm in Berlin. I stayed 2 or 3 years there. We started a fanzine, which turned into a magazine. And at the time I was involved in skateboarding. So this is not the magazine in question, but I also worked for Lowdown magazine from Berlin. And I was skateboarding, snowboarding at the time, and we started from scratch. And I was lucky to, after just a few months of taking pictures, having my first images published. And so I learned on, it was the beginning of accessible desktop publishing. It was Mac OS 8, still on SCSI, like crashing all the time, bad Nikon cool scanners, scanning blue, purple, strange skies, and so on. Then I moved to New York a bit. I spent a year there. This picture is taken there, 96, 97. And I lived in Spain, I lived in Prague, and finally I relocated to Switzerland in 2005, I think. It's a bit, I keep traveling a lot. And of course, after these years, skateboarding became a bit less of interest, and I met other people on the way, and I ended up working for a few years for this magazine from Italy called Uovo. and still it was still like a continuous experience of trying to see how things work and can work better. That means also not only taking pictures, but the more time passed, the more I became close to why magazines fail all the time because of distribution, why is it possible to be visible here or there, why you would like to be in that store but it's impossible. And I learned also from scratch what's a discount, what are payment terms and all these technical aspects. And I have to say I'm still learning today. I'll just show quickly some images because I first worked for the magazine as a contributor, so they published a series. That's 2005. I always forget exactly which year. So this is shot in Moscow. I realize how old it is already. And then it starts in Switzerland. This is my parents' garage. Spontaneously, I was working for various publications and publishers, and I realized there was no visibility at all in Switzerland, so I walked in the stores. I tried to put stuff on consignment, and quickly people were hearing about this, so I started working with mainstream magazine distributors, sending loads of books. And of course, as you know, there's a factor that's important. Speaking of magazines, is usually it goes only one way. It goes from the publisher to the distributor to the store, but it never comes back. Whereas books, as a retailer, you're able to return them. Whereas magazines, you can destroy them. So that's, I think, from my understanding now, a few years later, that's why magazines, most of the time, not only because of content or editorial positions, some of them go out of business because half their print run is systematically destroyed or getting lost. And there's a system called affidavit with all these mainstream distributors where the shop he just says, okay, this month I sold that many copies, please invoice. And the rest is all based on trust. And they don't even have to rip off the covers. It just goes to trash. So with Wovo, actually, we realized, working with that same distributor, that we could send 300 copies to Australia, and then the sales report were 15 copies, and each issue would cost €5 to print. And we just realized how easy it was to lose money because there was a lack of feedback from the distribution system. The distributor used sub-distributors who didn't want to provide info or where it would go because they all fear that you're gonna bypass them. So this raised a lot of questions, but on the way I experimented various things still to keep it to the scale. Like I didn't have a business plan or anything, and this is based in a village outside of Lausanne, and yeah, of course you have trucks coming and looking for a warehouse, a loading dock, and there is none. It's just my parents' garage. And well, it's not always that messy, but sometimes there's a delivery, all the boxes are there, I pack it in my car, I just go to an event. Sometimes I have to reorganize them between, but this maybe I can keep for later. On the way of learning discounts, visibility, all this, I managed to convince few stores. This is a chain store which you could compare to Borders. I mean, Borders is gone, I know, but so it's a smaller bookstore, but with all like general topics. And first they in Lausanne. First, they didn't want to have any ephemera, any magazines, but they tried on consignment with a few, and then they sold everything and asked me some more. So I managed to convince them, and so this is the first experiment of being able to display the titles the way I want. I can go in there. I'm not able to do it anymore, but I have somebody who walks in there and does the display a bit for them, and it's kind of there's no contract or anything. It's just very spontaneous. But there's a good, as you might know, the École school brings a lot of students, and there's a lot of workshops, and an international scene is coming. It's a very dynamic director there. So it has enough volume in terms of sales as well, so that it started from maybe, I don't know, a quarter of this, and now, except for Christmas, where they have to take stuff away and put calendars and stuff, or as you can see on the left, this is moleskins. So the moleskins are still there, but they tend to give visibility to really odd stuff as well. And with this idea, it's now that I think of it, I started as a distributor, and distributors, from what I've learned, they mostly have one function, and it's quite rare that they would step to something else than just have a warehouse, have a stock supply when people ask. They send newsletters, but most of them, if nobody comes to get the books, they are too busy, and so it kind of flattens a lot of things. You can see listings, and it's professional websites, but it's just lists of books, and it takes a skilled bookstore to see what they have. And sometimes even I've learned that distributors swap titles. So a distributor I had just a talk today, and this publisher told me, "Oh, our books are with them, but we don't really know. We never talk to them. But we just know our distributor is swapping boxes." And then we looked online, and we saw it was on the catalog. So I mean, it sounds a bit critical, but this is something I could reflect on after all these years. This is a temporary store I did in Bern. I was first concentrated only in the Swiss market, and of course I was really motivated. I drove with my car, and I knew if I was useless to send an email, I didn't even know how to send that email, because I wasn't in the system of not being a retailer. I wasn't in the system, so I couldn't get any newsletters. I just went spontaneously and say, "Hey, do you want this?" A bit like you do with fanzine. And I tested, and people liked it. I managed to do temporary stores, and I realized sometimes it's more efficient for the type of publications to do one event over a week, and the sales would be more than trying to convince a store for a full year to take some titles, and then they would take something, not really necessarily know much about it, so it would be filed somewhere, and then you would just come, and it would just be dusty, and you take it back. And I try to optimize my system all the time. And on the way of this, I met Urs Leni, who's a graphic designer based in Zurich. He's also making books. His imprint is called Rollo Press. And he runs this space in Zurich called Corner College. It's a non-profit where he invites people for presentations. They have a small movie theater, and they have talks, screenings, exhibitions. And so he invites me, and in this same idea, it was first time I tried to do a bookshop for a week with a presentation every second day. So I'm sure I don't know if you could read all the names, but Kilimanjaro is from London. of course, I had Wovo in there, and so it was an occasion to introduce to the public. It's nothing new. It's just maybe an enhanced book launch where for a week you could also come back and you have somebody who explains the books. The publisher is there, and it's coming closer to performative ways of distributing the books. So this is already, as a distributor, I already figured out this was efficient in terms of sales, because I always think my story is a bit romantic, but people quite often, they ask me if it makes sense. And of course I make many errors, but I think I managed to get sharper. And given the context, it works this way. I don't think it might sound like it's just trying to bring people who are in the know, or I don't know how to define it, that it kind of shrinks the audience, but I think it's not really. If you're able to interact with the schools, and if you have like a public, I mean, if you're in the school here, of course it would take people to know about the school and what the AA is. But in this case, it's in the red light district in Zurich, and it brings all kinds of funny situations, because there's hookers in front of the door at night, there's dealers around the corner. It's a very strange corner for Switzerland. And I of course, I wasn't planning to go and let's say, let's go there, but it kind of adds to the situation. And I think it brings more people. So this is the old display for Neve's books. It's a sculpture. So yeah, again, the same idea of the books on display. There's some also maybe something to go with on the wall, and there is no compromise. I've never made any compromise in my selection. I know this is film, but I could say I don't work with any mainstream publishers so far. There's no fight on. I'm not against it, but I realized as a focus, I was always wondering if listening to booksellers saying, "Oh, Moleskines, it kind of supports us. Like by selling Moleskines, we were able to go by a bit better," and I chose not to, and now the result in Berlin, it totally makes sense. But I don't know if it's the right decision. So Nice Books makes, he also pushed me into distribution, and he's making fanzines now. He's making also books with Rizzoli. And funnily, he's just launched an iPhone application. I think he's not scared of any new media, which I'm still quite far, but I'll just keep going. In the same building, they organized a zine fair. As you see, it's 2 years ago, with the people they like, their friends. I'll just leave this on. I think there are a few publishers from London. The next one is going to be the last one. It's actually this coming Sunday. And this is maybe a topic for later in this discussion. But yeah, just to keep the presentation going, I had to realize that it became more and more tempting to do a bookstore, and eventually I moved to Berlin for various reasons, and we found this space and that was full of stuff, and we didn't know it was in a backyard, and I was half looking for a photo studio, and my girlfriend opened a gallery just next to it. So everything came really quick, and this was late 2008. And I mean, it's a bit dark, but this used to be a frame factory, so I think it was like a showroom for frames and also like kind of expensive gold frames. So it was unoccupied for many years, and I just said, okay, let's risk it. I'll rent this and use it as a studio and as an office, and I'll open only on Saturdays. And yeah, of course, I'm quite, as you can see with these temporary stores and fairs and so on, I'm quite inspired from Christoph Keller's kiosk project to resume it. It was a traveling archive for almost 10 years, I think, of artist books displayed on a very easy way in various institutions, and he ended up having to buy a truck, and finally the truck wasn't enough, so he just, now last year he gave it to the arts library in Berlin. But his idea was collecting all these books on the way by meeting people, accepting. It's like a library, but in a performative way, so to say. And I heard one of his last talks when he presented it in Luxembourg, and he just said in that talk, which I felt was quite inspiring, that he always wished there was a small bookstore to go with, because people were able to browse the books, but only usually for a few hours, and more than half these books were still available, but then it would take some efforts to search them more, and he regretted. So I think this, consciously or not, was quite an inspiration to all these temporary stores, and I discovered the kiosk project on the way, but this is one aspect. And speaking of opening only on Saturdays, I think I was then also inspired by Dexter Sinister's bookstore in New York. And yeah, it was also, since I started from scratch, I just had money to pay the first rent almost, and I just built it up like this. So of course I couldn't open every day, but after 3 months, I think we opened Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then we eventually now the stores open Monday, Saturday. And it's a remote location in Berlin, meaning it's totally not central, and I mean it's a bit too dark on this, but this is the view from the street, so I was lucky that there's this sign. We just, it cost like 40 euros to make a sticker, and that was it. We got it. And this is an installation from Bhatia Sutta. So there are vitrines. You could see them. You could guess them. This is the entrance of the gallery. It's an old building from, I think, from the 30s. So it's a very nice courtyard, but of course it takes to know it, to find it, and you wouldn't go and just, oh yeah, look, a bookstore. It's really hidden. So we've done lots of presentations with the same idea. This is the interior with books. I think that's still a year ago now. It's totally full. The table's bigger. We did a lot of events, and we just counted now. I think we did 85 events in 2 years. So that's how we built the audience, by trying to invite people we liked and putting them in context. And
could I maybe interrupt and just ask you, what is the audience? Presumably, it seems like it may be graphic designers, but presumably it's more than that.
The audience is so far quite young, and I think it's a lot of students, a lot of people who use the internet. We started a blog that I kind of started spontaneously. It was first just a WordPress, really. It's not really designed. And I think this works quite well. So the audience is students, artists. I think we have a strong graphic design audience because we stock all of Hyphen Press, for example, and given the fact that we started in Switzerland, and just met a lot of people from Netherlands, then I think this defines the type of content quite well. So recently I also started selling editions, so we also have collectors, and it kind of interacts well with the gallery sometimes, that somebody will come for the bookshop and learn about the gallery, or somebody would come for a show in the gallery, and there's a third space in the same courtyard. So and it's from curators, and one of them writes for a long time for all European magazines. I think he's the editor for Fries, the Berlin editor. So they bring older people. So it's mixing quite well, I think. And yeah, recently, after 2 years, I had like totally unexpected people coming. But I think most of the audience is like in their 25, 30s. So, yeah. So, jumping back. The content of the store is, this is near the entrance, is a bit more lifestyle. We have a bit of fashion. We have a big corner with back issues. This is already an older picture. But as I mentioned before, we started with magazines because there was no network at all in Switzerland. So now it extended, and I think we work with more than 100 publishers worldwide, but of course we're more competitive on certain markets. But I think something that's particular to what we do is we never destroy any magazines. So it is of course painful in terms of business, but I realize after a while it makes sense, and we have 2 big shelves with about 30, 40 magazines with any possible issue that's still available for a reasonable price. We have like a few rare books, but yeah, my family is not in book business, so it's a bit too early. And yeah, I don't know if I'll step. Yeah, I feel quite far away from the white glove situation. But this is trying to be a bit more accessible, and otherwise we have graphic design, we mentioned. This is a shelf we have for ... Onomatopoeia is from Holland, and this is from Belgium. Gagarin. I'll just go quick because these are actually pictures from the very beginning. So you see the store is really empty. Kilimanjaro, pictogram from Poland. And we have, in the middle of the store, we have this big table which we use to present new stuff, but also a few times a year we invite a publisher and give them the table to present their whole publishing program. Yeah, this is the store's cat, Tinte.
Which means?
He's just...
ink, right?
Mm?
The name of the cat?
Tinte.
Tinte.
It means ink.
Yeah.
She was, just speaking of her, she was quite helpful. I remember receiving this Japanese city guide where I could only read 2 names, and one was Motto and the second was Tinte for the story. We, as you mentioned before, we organized a book fair, so I can go quick. It was a first experiment in a way to connect with all the publishers who were writing emails. This is a display of vintage Neves zines. Yeah, I think you came. No, you didn't. We invited Bedford, Dandelione, Obake's imprint, and who else from London? It was basically 68 publishers from 18 countries. Some people were flying from LA. And I mean, if you're familiar with the book fairs, this is a bit more customized. I would say it's in between a Publish and Be Damned and Whitechapel. Not to sound too pretentious, it's quite inspired from the New York Art Book Fair. But we organized this one, we co-organized with Neves and Rollo Press with Urs on the invitation of Christoph Keller. And this goes back to the comment I made before, where he showed his kiosk at the library, but he wanted something a bit more dynamic, and he wanted to have a small book fair with artist books. So we ended up doing it together, to keep it short. And the Kunstwerke, the institution who also organized the Berlin Biennale, did another fair. So it kind of looked like the Whitechapel fair here and Publish and Be Damned, except that we tried from the start to mix with institutions, because again, if you ask me about my audience, I think my audience responds to some kind of attitude towards publishing, and even if I say we don't work with mainstream publishers, it's not, I don't want this to be a statement. I think I'm concerned with attitude. So we also have bigger institutions but who still work on a fairly experimental mode, like Jan van Eyck or Casco. So they may be funded and in a system of institutional configuration, whereas the artist, of course, they just need to get 1,000 euros or sometimes even 500, and they just do a book. But we like to work with people who just, when it comes to do the book, they don't need to position themselves into a certain frame, and they can do a pamphlet as well as a coffee table at 300 pages. And I think that's also, I mean, speaking here in this room, that's also what you're trying to do with Bedford. And yeah, I like this attitude, and I think this is why sometimes surprisingly certain institutions do stuff, but since they work with mainstream distributor, I mean, I call them mainstream or established. I just don't want to use the term old school because it would sound bad or pretentious, but their books are, I just, for example, I bought just now some books from Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart. It's a castle with a big publishing program, but they use this very formal delivery service distribution, and some of their books are really odd, or they're like strange poster or sets of postcards, and they just called me last week. They wanted to destroy some books, and one of them is a really nice postcard set of the German parliaments. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
And they just wanted to get rid of it, 500 copies. So I was just doing business, then I just bought them for really cheap. But this is something somehow the institution has the power to do that, but then this is when things become interesting for me, because I feel there's many things I can do, because I can sell this well, and in this case, their delivery service people, they were like, no, this is too strange. It's two books, and it's not packaged or anything. So they're like, how do we display this? How do we pack it? So this is interesting. So yeah, images of the fair, bootlegs, and just people meeting. This is more images. I think the slideshow doesn't go for too long. This is an image sent by Roger Willems, who's one of the two persons behind Roma publications from Amsterdam, the other one being the artist Mark Manders. Roger Willems is a graphic designer. And speaking again of attitudes, I think this is the perfect combination of an artist and a graphic designer joining their efforts to publish, and they can control and not fall too much into one category or the other. And yeah, I'm always surprised. They published in 10 years, I think, 150 titles. And from hearing, some of the stuff is really, he does these fake newspapers who are sometimes distributed for free, and they just keep a small batch, so it's still available for sale for super cheap. And what he was saying is 1 out of 10 books he makes is just being careful that it's a commercially good proposal, so that this 1 out of 10 books kind of supports the others, even if it's funded and it's a foundation. I think they've been pretty successful at being really experimental, working with many different printers. And of course, this is another discussion. I mean, if you start discussing funding in the Netherlands, in the UK, in France, or Germany, or Switzerland, it's quite different. I think some people are in the streets tonight to talk about it as well. But I mean, that's not my topic. Just to keep going, we gave them the whole table. So some of these titles are out of print. Some are only in Dutch, and they also become objects. And we also give them, we have this small room in the back, which unfortunately now is our office because we have too many books. But at the time we installed a reading room with the very first Roma title that was 3 weeks on display, with a few editions. Mark Manders. So these are images of the fake newspapers. And Roger Willems' wife, Batja Suter, made these prints in the vitrines. So this works as an event with a talk. Louis Luthi did a talk about a recent book he published. Actually, no, that was in Zurich. After we repeated that in Zurich. But this is a light format exhibition with a reading room, the books on display. So I think it's a quite complete presentation, and it gives time as well, because yeah, we can talk about book fairs a bit. I mean, even now, but. I'm wondering, after organizing these book fairs, I'm wondering what's coming next. I'll show 2 projects, and I think we can, the slideshow will be finished. This is, we were packing, I was invited, we work with Philip. He's a journal from Vancouver. It's arts writing and criticism. It's some artist and curator and a graphic designer. It's together with the Emily Carr School. And they invite me to, they had funding, so they invite me to do a temporary store at ArtSpeak, as an artist-run space, in May this year. And so the store was 3 months, every Saturday. We had a publisher or a personality coming to do a talk. I did the first one. Stuart Bailey from Dexter Sinister came. Wendy Yao from Ooga Booga bookstore in LA came. Meta Haven publication studio, like mixing international and local scenes. This, I mean, it looks a bit slick, I have to say. I'm always amazed by the pictures. we also had the Neves zine library on display. So with 3 months, it was quite a successful project, given the fact that we had money to fly me over, pay for shipping, and invite all these people, and the sales. Many titles were for the first time on display, and the sales turned out to be pretty good. So the result is Jeff Konsari eventually asked me to, we've been talking about it for 6 months, but now just before, I think 2 months ago, I'm not sure, whatever, this is opening actually tonight. It's our 4th branch in Or Gallery. It's another, it's a commercial gallery that exists since 83. They're also active in publishing. So this is the entrance of the gallery, where we'll have as you can see, a smaller version of a bookstore. This is Ford in Geneva, and the curators are changing every second year. No, every curators have a 2 years program. They have to propose, and then if they are chosen, it's rotating. And in their project, they wrote that they want to do a bookstore as an extension of their exhibitions program. So this is something I can accept quite easily, because if you look, I should specify that if you look now from far away, it just looks like I have a lot of money and I opened 4 stores in 2 years. But looking at the details, it's still trying to be careful, and even this is not so easy. But this is the opening of their curatorship was 1 month's bookstore with furniture they made. Another project in Stuttgart at the Künstlerhaus, who at the time, this is in March. At the time, the Künstlerhaus had Axel Wieder as a director, and Axel Wieder is one of the 3 people who run ProQM in Berlin, which is to me one of the best bookstores in Europe. I used to go there to get all my stuff. It exists for 10 years. So again, that's somebody who he invited me quite spontaneously, but I could just say yes, and we displayed 4 big tables, one with Dutch publishers, one with artist books or fanzines, handmade, another table with magazines, and we had a record player. So you would just try to keep it dynamic, and people could come. It was in their exhibition venue, so it was presented as an exhibition, but you could eventually buy any of the books if you wanted. The schools visited, and this again proved to be a very good format for Stuttgart, because I don't work myself, for example, with any bookstore in Stuttgart. There are, I think, few titles could make it, but otherwise the type of publications is too specific, and it wouldn't be economically working, unless I'm wrong, but I think it's too small. So this is it, and I'll just show the first temporary store I did in Zurich ended up being now our permanent store. I'll just show quickly some images. So there's still no questions, and but I think maybe you could.
This topic of other bookstores is actually perhaps a good way to open with my first question, which is, you set up in Berlin in late 2008, early 2009, is that right? in Berlin, where there was, I guess, already established bookstores for the kind of material that you also sell, such as ProQM, which you already mentioned, various Koenig branches in some of the bigger art institutions and galleries, and many other magazine outlets. And I wonder how Motto fits in with and engages with this small but presumably competitive scene.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, as I described the store before, I realized it was better to be more experimental. And for example, speaking of Roma, I realized all the other bookstores, they only had 2 or 3 titles, and I chose to take the risk to display all their program, inviting them. And now people, when they search that type of book, they come to me. Also, right next door to us is B Books, who's also for 15 years a good publisher, mostly in German, a lot of theory, but also artist books. So it was natural that I'm not gonna have the same titles as they do. And I have to admit, my German is too poor, and I don't read German, so I'm not really selling German books. But the idea of selling back issues of magazines was also more like a personal, not a dream, but it was. I've been collecting them myself, and I was like, oh yeah, I wonder if it makes sense, and I wasn't too sure if it makes sense. But now I can tell. Of course, it's a much slower rhythm, but it creates the identity or the why people like to visit us, having these magazines, archives, all kinds of bootlegs or fragile things. I'm lucky to have these vitrines, so we can also present more like object-like books. And yeah, I just think we pushed it a bit further. ProQM also, they don't really have signed editions, I think, because they don't have the space, but they are much better about theory, or because they exist for 10 years, so I'm still learning myself. And I didn't study art history or anything, I just learned it from scratch. So yeah, I think my interest is more artist books, and there are stores for zines, but to me only zines would become a bit boring, or I don't know. I'm not sure how to define. I've tried many things, but I realized that's what I said before. I don't have to have Moleskines or any major publishers with that sometimes they offer really good discounts. I'd rather, I think, buy artist books and maybe keep some and see if they become rare, and this is also something that galleries or booksellers, book dealers I should say, recommended doing. This is how Koenig operates as well.
Right. I'm also interested in going back to, I guess, the start of your slideshow, talking about the more established distributors and distribution networks. So for those of us that work in art, architecture, design, publishing, we're perhaps familiar with people like Art Data in the UK, Idea in Europe, RAM in the States. You suggested that perhaps there was something lacking in their particular distribution models, and I wonder if they've in any way responded to Motto. Have they? I mean, you have dealings with these distributors, so I just would question if there's a relationship that has somehow changed or developed.
Well, I work with all of them, and I have a bit this hybrid position, because one day I'll talk to them as a distributor, another day as an event organizer, and another day just as a retailer trying to get their books, and sometimes even as a publisher somehow. But I could see that they are starting to Some things start to move, yeah. I've seen a bunch of newsletters, but as I think this is how I would define what I realized we were doing is we cover all the aspects from editorial to running a blog as a distributor. We have like a transparent Amazon page, even which you could access directly from the website. And you see what we put on Amazon, and we use Motto Books as a name. So I think this is a difference. But I have to say, I've never been to the Frankfurt Book Fair, for example. So book trade, I'm still, I think they still perceive me as a kind of romantic fanzine distributor, perhaps. From what I hear sometimes, I don't know if they are ready to. I don't know if all of them are ready to change. I mean, there are also new initiatives like Textfield or a few others who kind of use the same model. But yeah.
I mean, it perhaps seems
they
inevitable that these distributors will have to very quickly think about changing, given certainly this year, the massive increased interest in, or the commercial interest, I should say, in ebooks and e-readers. This is undoubtedly going to have an impact.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, maybe this is actually a question to get onto. I was perhaps a little bit unsure whether to bring this subject up in relation to Motto, this idea of ebooks and e-publishing. But I wanted to get your thoughts on how you see yourself and the art publishing industry in general responding to these new ways of reading. And there was a recent symposium at the ICA. The writer Andrei Schifrin perhaps suggested that the format is secondary to content, but that I would suggest that maybe is not actually so easily applicable to publications that rely on a much closer relationship between content and materiality, the sort of stuff that you and people like you deal with.
I think this is also what made me go in this direction, saying what kind of niche or position I found in Berlin is also me thinking like, okay, what's gonna last, what's gonna stay. And of course I know the artist books will be more rare, but that's the only printed form that will stay. That's nothing new. In the New York Art Book Fair, we had this Philip presented the ARG library as in this furniture with a set of cards, kind of an inventory of all the titles that have been uploaded on ARG. And after the book fair, we did a temporary store.
Could you maybe just explain what ARG is?
ARG quickly? is kind of a Napster, if you remember it, for critical and theory texts. So, of course, the website is frequently taken down, and what he does is he just registers the name, adding an A. So I think it has a bunch of A's. So it's arg.org. And I know the servers are in Lithuania, but whatever. We had this talk with the public school about ARG, and there were the creator of ARG, Sean, is also one of the founders of the public school. We had this talk about ARG. He wasn't there, but I realized that many people using ARG, they just used it as a research tool, and they eventually ended up buying the hard copy of the book to really read it because they didn't want to spend that many hours on reading PDFs. So it kind of helps in the end, ARG helps these publishers like Verso and so on for people to rediscover, because I'm sure there's some, it's kind of illegal, so there's some hype as well. I'm sure people go there just to check it out, and academics, they they also use it as a tool. But I heard some of the publishers are actually happy. Some of them asked for stuff to be taken down, but others are like, oh, we're starting to sell that title again because it's been there. So of course, yeah, I totally, the e-publishing, and speaking of my blog, I did everything. We don't print paper flyers anymore for any of the events, and of course I use Facebook and so on. I mean, I'm not interested to discuss that, but obviously it just adds to the visibility, and it's just free. So yeah, I mean, every time we post we have 3,000 plus IPs on our blog just for some repros, some badly shot repros of covers, and sometimes not even a link, and people write us and they want to buy this stuff. Like I ordered books from Portugal from this publisher. Half of them were only in Portuguese, but I just it was recommended to me, and I liked the graphic design. I just said, okay, let's order 2 copies, and then I ended up shipping them back to Portugal because the publisher is not able to get proper visibility. So that's kind of absurd, but it's not e-publishing, but somehow I could imagine that. I mean, I'm sure the e-libraries, they're gonna be thousands this year. Everybody has the same idea, and yeah, the iPhone app where you have to pay for a fanzine, why not? But I'm not gonna be the one to buy that fanzine.
Yeah. I mean,
online,
it's
but I'm sure some people will.
It's in the early stages for sure. I think I guess projects like that will kind of live and die by the audience reaction. But I still would wonder, and you mentioned this idea of revived texts, which there's been a kind of recent interest or re-interest in. Various small presses reigniting hard to find or long out of print material. People like Occasional Papers have recently released a reprint of a Stephen Willett's book. Roller Press does a bootleg series. And on a slightly different scale, people like Four Corners produce some quite lavishly designed and illustrated versions of classic novels. And I mean, there's been various articles that I've read recently that suggest that these are the kind of texts that will benefit most from e-publishing because it doesn't there's no real cost involved or any kind of risk involved in republishing these obscure niche texts. And in relation to people like Four Corners Press, I think you have one of the books with you there. How critical is it that they're banned, printed and banned on paper? Can you foresee a time when these kind of books will quite easily exist as ebooks?
Yeah, of course. I don't really know what to think about this, but I think
Or
of
maybe
course they
perhaps
will. But will it?
But
be
I mean, to the detriment of the printed version, I guess is what I mean. I mean, the people that come into Motto, have you had conversations, or is there any indication perhaps of people's interest in?
Well, you have the two sides. I think I want to sit in the middle. The one side is people will tell you, and I want to agree, is that a photo book to me, it's on paper. Of course, I can look at 1,000 portfolios and repros, but I'm not really seduced by issue and the fake scrolling and the fake shadows. I think I'm curious to see this in 20 years where we'll be like, oh, remember they had these fake shadows. Oh, that's so cheesy.
Yeah, I guess that's perceived as a kind of transitionary tool to.
And they have
make
the
people
sound
comfortable.
they have the sound of paper. And I just think on the other side you have people who be like, oh, forget about it. It's all gonna be digital, and I think only tabloids and bad quality publishers have to worry. The ones who produce quality books, they will even be more. I mean, to me, somehow it's almost like comparing an MP3 to a concert, in a way. it's not the same experience.
Yeah, that's a good comparison, I think.
You need one as much as you need the other, of course.
So there will be, perhaps they will support each other and find
I
their
mean, all these
natural
books,
audiences.
like, they're going to be listed online somewhere. It's still going to take the same amount of work for somebody to let people know that they are available. It's just not because you have 3 million books digitalized that it will take the same efforts for people to know about them. To, like, yeah, of course, like, what are you going to do? We're going to do a book launch on the screen, and there's not going to be probably, if you want to buy this book, just grab your phone and click buy, and I don't know, I think there's going to be new forms of instantly clicking and buying it instead of, but then you couldn't have it signed, so what are you going to do?
Good point. Just to move on a little bit, you showed quite a few examples of motto appearing and installing at art institutions. I think you also did something recently at Witte de Wit in Rotterdam. In this context of a gallery space, publishing and graphic design is ostensibly being presented and discussed at the same level as art, as part of visual culture rather than merely as a commercial activity. And I'm just curious to know what you think about where this repositioning or this new cultural role has emerged from, and what part you play in that.
Yeah, I think my knowledge is a bit too young to really reflect. It would take somebody like Seth Ziglaub or Rick Poynter or whoever to reflect on that. But I think, I mean, I can see there's a trend aspect, of course, in this, which you wonder if it's gonna last. But I think I could more see why a book sells and why not, and some books I receive, I know from the start, even if the artist is interesting, if the book is designed like this, it's gonna sell 5 copies, and another one with some obscure content but well designed will sell hundreds. So I don't know where this comes from. Because I don't have the background, I think. I mean, it's only 4 years now, so it's still too early to see which difference, because even if I was looking, I was only a reader before. So I don't know exactly what to say about this.
But you seem to occupy this kind of. I think I read on possibly the Witte de Wit website. It's quite aptly described motto as existing in a kind of institutional grey area, which I thought was a good description for what you do. And I think you've described that quite well.
Yeah. That's this question of attitude that I tried to define before. That it takes certain minds to be in an institutional position, but really, I mean, like people like Harald Zeeman broke many rules many years ago, and I think this is still using the same ideas, and kind of they adapt themselves to the accessibility to computers and printers, and print on demand is growing now. You have, speaking of it, you have Lulu and so on, but this is also an early stage, and I can hear now with the people I talk with that they want to use digital printing, which sometimes becomes more and more difficult to differentiate from offset, depending on which paper you use, how you retouch the images. And that's where also I think the interaction with graphic designers, it's much more tempting. I think before, if I imagine 15 years ago, I remember the first magazines we had to print, we had to have enough ads and get like 20,000 Swiss francs or more to print one issue, whereas now you could just like at the RCA, the Royal College of Art, I've received recently 3 different titles, and some of them are crazy big. Sarah, I think the Bond was involved in one, but others is just people printing 100, 200 copies, and it's just a graphic designer having the access and resources within the school to print for cheap. So this is, I think, a new ingredient in the landscape. Whereas before, I imagine like having to shoot on film, develop, scanned, and it costs much more. And buying a computer, you could buy. I remember we started with Macintosh clones from Schneider. Do you remember those?
I remember them. Yeah, just about.
So that was their early start, and we went to these studios, and I want to scan this picture. Oh yeah, it will cost you 100. I'm like, no, I have like 60 to scan. I don't have money. Oh yeah, but they were like, who are you? Like, just go back to school or something.
So people are more enabled, perhaps, these days.
I think this defines it. And back to print on demand, artists are becoming more and more interested to work with printers, and printers start to understand that averagely an artist book is at least 500 copies or 1,000. But now you have publishing projects like One Star Press, we started already almost 10 years ago, and it's print on demand. So every time they have an order, they print a book. And they don't have to have 10,000 to just print 1,000 copies. They can just do it day by day and build it up like that. And the quality is becoming more and more. You have different papers, the bindings. It's becoming
catching up with more
it's becoming more and more versatile.
Maybe we should open up to the floor in a couple of minutes. I just have one more question, which relates to this topic of production, and that is the question of overproduction in art publishing. As much as I personally love visiting book fairs and participating in book fairs and discovering new material, it can also be very exhausting. Recently, the most recent book fair that we participated in was the New York Art Book Fair in November, and I found that I was really overwhelmed just by the sheer quantity of stuff. And maybe this perhaps seems like, from one angle, a good thing that there's so much enthusiasm and so much production going on, but at the same time, I wanted to suggest that maybe there's a loss of editorial objectivity and authority. Or should we just encourage people to do whatever they like and just let the book buying audience decide? What do you think about this?
Well, I think the audience will decide in the end, and now it's kind of trendy as well to be a publisher. As Urs Leni always tells me, 10 years ago you had to be a DJ, and today you could be a publisher.
Right. So Urs runs Roller Press, and we actually received an interesting email today in relation to the Zurich session on Sunday, which Motto is co-organising, which Urs, I think, said something like, this will be the last zine session and to commemorate the end of the book fair age. That was the term, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a semi-joke, but still, experiencing all these models. Like this Vancouver project to me is the most interesting, or going to Witte de Witt, and I've done few book fairs, but as you say, in New York, I think A.A. Bronson wrote that it was 16,000 people in a few days, and it's impossible. But for sure, people will decide. Publishers. If you listen to Christoph Keller's story, to speak about him again, he just said how fast he spent 30,000 Deutschmarks publishing some books, and he just had no idea where they would go. And of course, he did some nice books, so now they're really valuable, but I could totally see people now spending the same amount of money and just realizing like, oh no, nobody's buying them, and it will take it wouldn't take that long before they realize they can't print the next book. So I think the system will decide for them if they're not careful enough. And you can see that. You can see, of course, we receive so many samples and emails. I'm not able to answer, but it's I think any bookstore who's a bit active is in this position. But still, I think it's not gonna take long before. People who are in the publishing world for a long time, they know, and I always look at them and see how slow they are. And first I was like, but come on, why is it? Then I realized why they try to slow down. So this is something I need to learn still. But yeah, it's a logic. It's logic. Like if we just describe how easy it is to do it now, it's of course people. Of course, it goes in all directions, and yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, from my point of view, I think I'm in the most obscure chapter of the whole chain of publishing. Like I'm carrying boxes, and that's something also people tend to forget. They're just excited, and then they're like, oh, I have these 1,000 books, like where am I going to store them? It's pretty basic things in the end. So that's why you have institutions also calling me like, hey, we want to destroy all this. I'm like, no. But eventually I'm sure it happens. So I think the audience will decide if it goes on or not. But yeah, I don't know if you were last year in New York. I think this year was
this was our first year, yeah.
This year was really crazy compared to last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can say I sold like 5 times more. My table was bigger, but still 5 times is a lot more. So there's really, it's really a trend.
Do we have any questions from the audience? We have a microphone here if anybody wishes to offer up any questions.
Hi. I guess, like you said, we're in a seemingly protracted transitional phase that probably started with Gutenberg, and maybe is being decided by Steve Jobs. I'm not sure, but I guess whenever there's a feeling that we're undergoing a certain technological paradigm shift, you know, that the world divides into kind of hysterical progressives who will immediately denounce whatever exists already, right? So the book is dead, library is dead, except the newspaper is dead, you know, and they do so with a kind of almost erotic glee. And then at the same time, there are, you know, sort of die-hard kind of, you know, acolytes who don't, you know, who are either scared of change or don't want to see change because that also reminds them that they're, you know, beyond a certain kind of generational cut-off point. But I wonder, it seems, I mean, with the book fair, I've been to your bookshop in Berlin, and it was lovely, but it was also, like you used the word overwhelmed. And I mean, I remember 10 years ago, I could go into a bookshop like Magma, and I would know every single title of, you know, of independent as well as commercial magazine, and you could kind of chart it. And it's phenomenal how in 10 years that has exponentially sort of mushroomed to a point now where it really just gives me a headache. I mean, I wouldn't know how to keep up. And in a funny way, I kind of got a similar headache in your bookshop. But it's a good headache, right? But it's also so overwhelming. But it seems to me there's enough genuine nostalgia, you know, by people who are beyond a certain age who actually experienced print, you know, as it has been directly, so that they could kind of maintain that. But also, there seems to me there will always be a kind of even invented nostalgia by successive generations that will somehow keep this thing going. Because, you know, if there's one thing that cool people like to do is to somehow go against the trend of whatever the dominant, you know, velocity is at that point. And I'm wondering whether, you know, because I think nostalgia is often considered to be a sort of a negative,
A weakness.
a weakness in a way. But when it comes to this topic, it seems to me, in a way, nostalgia may be the force through which, you know, some of the things that we perhaps cherish will be maintained. And I'm wondering whether you think that's a fair point, and where, you know, it's not so much where should we, because I mean I always think you know, I wonder, it would be great to have someone who's 14 years old here, you know, or 12 years old, right?
Yeah.
Because again, we're all above us, it seems to me, a certain generational threshold where still there are certain things that we can kind of agree on, you know, but kids who are at 10, 11, 12 watch TV on their laptops, right? Which doesn't mean that television as a medium is dead, but the notion of watching it around in that social context of the living room with the TV in the corner maybe as dead, you know? So I wonder, but where do you stand on this question of, or this issue of nostalgia in relation to it being a positive or kind of negative force? And is there a way in which we can actually embody a productive form of nostalgia to kind of fight against, as I say, a sort of modernizing, you know, Eric Hobsbawm's thing about a protest against forgetting. And it seems to me one of the things that technologists want to do is induce a certain amount of amnesia in us, you know.
Yeah. There are various things I think about, and this, of course, the same as topic you describe is I wonder if my kids will be used to read only digital devices, and you could guess, okay, there could be a genetic mutation or whatever, I'm not using the right words, but that they will be born with that, thinking that I've had my first class on a Commodore 64 and black and white, or actually green and black. But I think I just try to embrace the whole system, and as a distributor, using the blog is clearly using e-publishing, but it's also defined by a lack of time, but we try to show the books in their physicality, so we try to not bother or actually even make it that there's a reflection that you could see the object. So I think this interacts, and of course, yeah, I mean, I'm probably sounding nostalgic, but I don't mind so much, and I would just fight for content. And as we described, overwhelming production, you know, I'll just end up using everything, and I just, if it takes it, I mean, with music, everybody thought everything would disappear, and then everybody learned about iTunes and their policies to accept music online or not, and now you still see there's an independent channel, and I mean, I'm not an expert about music, but I'm pretty sure there's gonna be artists, and it's quite a discussion lately, and artists have been using books as an extension of their work more and more, and many of them, you have the ones who have been doing it forever, or the ones everybody looks up to, like Solowit or whoever else, but I don't think it's nostalgia, I don't know, it's just I would use again the MP3 versus the concert thing, and it's the digital media flattens many things. But what's the most interesting to me is if I do a bookstore and clearly I have to sell the books, but we co-organize a talk about ARG, about a pirate project, which tends to, in the end, makes the physical books sell more. This is the most interesting moment to me. So I would just say I want to embrace everything and not sound like a, like, oh no, I'm like such a fan of Fluxus and all these books, and I don't want to see them digitalized. No, I want to see them digitalized, but the ones I will enjoy the most is the ones I will have in my hands, I think. But of course, I'm not able to go to the MoMA library or wherever good library there is. So yeah, I'll end up using the internet. But it's also, to me, a discussion is, there's also a lot of reading rooms recently with people who have this idea of putting a certain type of books so that people could access them. But also, yeah, same as you wonder if people will publish books for long and how they will do it. Like a reading room, which you would say is a portable library or a smaller library. It's so much effort. And just indexing, if you speak to a librarian, he will tell you it takes up to a few hours per title to make sure it's done properly. So I think there's a quality in the initiative of doing these reading rooms and bringing people together, and that's how the books live. But also there's a question of how good or how accurate the content is. And I don't know anything, but I always hear these stories of the French NRF, I don't know what's the UK, this literature books, and I was hearing that it takes up to 10 years for an historical book to verify if to do the copy editing. That means they used to send physically somebody to the place where the action or where the name would come from and verify if it was spelled correctly. And so imagine 10 years before the book is printed. Imagine now it's 10 minutes. It's like now here it's filmed, tomorrow it's online. So yeah, maybe I sound nostalgic, I don't know. I think people will be careful. There's going to be an overproduction, and then people will be careful again. They will lose enough money so that they will think twice before it goes to print. That's already, if you look at, speaking of magazines, if you look at the face and how kind of, I don't know the details, but to me from far away, I could see it faded because it lasted for long enough. And at the same time, Vice came in as a free, arrogant, trashy kind of tabloid style. And it didn't push them away, but they kind of faded a bit faster and disappeared. And now I can see a title like Dazed going digital, and who knows for how long they will print on paper. I think that's the first changes. But as far as artist books, they will become pieces then. They will just be more expensive. I don't know if this answers. I talked for a while.
I realize I am nostalgic, and I think, I don't know, a bit like an alcoholic who says, I have a problem. Maybe I feel like it's actually good to say that, or to kind of acknowledge it, perhaps, that, again, I feel I'm part of I can't deny my historical positioning, I can't change the fact that I was born at a certain point. You engage with certain things in a certain point in your life, etc., etc. This forms who you are, and this is always shifting. And I guess, I love that thing that McLuhan said, right, which is that, we judge every new media. One of the ways we get things wrong with new technologies or new media is that we always judge it. We judge the performance based on the media that we're used to at the moment, and that's why we have this kind of trauma, because we're like, well, yeah, but the book does this, and the website doesn't do what the book does, and it's a completely false, it's a really erroneous way of judging something, but it's also human nature, because you build up certain certitudes about how reality is constituted, and then someone comes along and says, no, it's not going to be like that. So, but I think it's important to say on the one hand that yes, this is where we as an individual, if you're 50, 40 years old, 30, 20 or 10, you're situated, but then also seems to me important to be open to what else is happening. But I think that business of what you're saying, it was interesting yesterday. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, made his speech about the whole education change, and of course, in classic conservative rhetoric, it was, well, if we bring in free market dynamics into education, that will basically, again, let the audience choose. Right? Let the students choose which universities are good, which are not good, which courses are good, which are not good. Classic kind of free market dynamics, which suggests that somehow that the will of the mass is always right. And to go back to something that you quoted Andrei Shifrin, it was kind of interesting because I guess one of the thrusts in his book, which is so ill-timed, it seems to me, but is that he looks at the French and the Norwegian model, right? Which is that actually publishing should be seen as a public institution, right? So that the French publishers get their money partly funded from the government, as do Norwegians, etc., etc. Which, of course, I mean, that's where it seems to me, ideologically, I totally agree with him, but in the current, and it seems to me inevitable future landscape of how the global economies work, which is more and more, seems to me, of neoliberal free market, kind of dynamics. That's a deeply nostalgic. I mean, I wish it was the case, but it seems also a bit slightly, not a forward-looking.
It sounds a bit paralyzing.
Yeah. As well, which is the same thing that's said about something like the New York Times, right? That okay, we can let local newspapers go, but something like the New York Times it's an international public institution, which has to be thought of differently, to the